Lance Ferguson, welcome to Australian Musician.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me along.
We're talking about this great new project, Ferguson Rogers Project with Tim Rogers, and the debut album, Style and or Substance. I think it's fair to say it's a disco album.
I think it's definitely informed by disco. I think Tim and I have talked about that great time in the early 80s, and I think that was a great time for music. But specifically, I remember being a youngster and watching a show called Sounds, hosted by the great Donny Sutherland. And I think I was watching that show in the around 81, 82, and I remember seeing, video clips for things like Talking Heads, Once in a Lifetime, Musical Youth, The Go-Go's, Tom Tom Club, and there was this great kind of clash of, I guess, disco had kind of combined with the early era of hip hop, and then you had new wave coming through. There was all this kind of, and there was a tropical influence coming through as well, and you had all this music and a kind of clash of stuff, and it was a real explosion. And one of my favorite times of music, and I think the album is influenced. I think not specifically by the specific musical things of that, but just the idea of the almost global village kind of clash of sounds that came out of that time. That the approach and the concept of that, I think, was an inspiration. And disco, as maligned a kind of genre as it was in the late 70s, with people burning disco records and things like that, it informed a lot of stuff that came after it, and it still informs a lot of music now in just mainstream pop music. I mean, disco is everywhere, so it's fair to say disco underpins a lot of this record.
Yeah, is the type of album that you've wanted to make for a long time?
Um, the album kind of had a false start because we started doing it and then we had to leave it for about a year. So it's good that it's finally here and it's finished. But I had worked with Tim. Gee, we've been working together for 13, 14 years now, since the first Bamboo song he came in on, which was called I Got Burned. But then we did a full Bamboos and Tim Rogers record called The Rules of Attraction. But then this record is obviously taking in different influences, and I guess coming out of lockdown and all of the psychological aspects of that which went along with it, one of which was missing a bunch of people being in a room up close and personal, jumping around to loud music and expressing yourself in that way. I was kind of missing that, and I think everyone was. And I wanted to, I guess, essentially make a dance record, but with Tim bringing all of his eccentricities and beautiful idiosyncrasies lyrically and melodically into it. It's a dance record, but he's able to sort of twist it into something that I think has a sound all of its own.
Yeah, there are definitely some authentic disco era guitar motifs on the record. Who are your references? I mean, surely Nile Rodgers must have been a bit of an influence.
Nile Rodgers is always an influence. I just love those Chic productions and him and Bernard Edwards. I mean, the work is amazing. And I as I guess a musician across the board, whether it's production or guitar playing, I'm a guitar player by trade. It was the first thing I kind of started doing in music. I'm always just trying to judge myself and compare myself with what the best thing is. So if it's a record that's going to be in the disco realm, then I go, well, it needs to try. I need to try and make the sound as good as a Chic production or a Quincy Jones production. And of course, I'm not going to be able to achieve that. But if I can just aim towards that, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction. So I think, yeah, Chic and Quincy Jones. This is in terms of, I guess, the sonics and the getting in the weeds of the mix of the tracks. But yeah, in terms of just a general influence, I mean, I think, as I was saying earlier, groups like Talking Heads and the splinter group Tom Tom Club. I think that early era of hip hop coming out of New York, a lot of the rhythms sort of underpinning that, which was often sampled disco records as well. But the whole thing with this, even though um, these touchstones and references are there, I'm always thinking the whole time with any of these things that we have to put a 2024 twist on it. So hopefully, it can sit alongside records that are coming out now as well in terms of the sonics of it.
Yeah. Speaking of the guitar parts, did you use your 335 for most of this album?
I see my 335 there. That is my mainstay bamboo's kind of live guitar. I just always like to keep it close by. But the guitar I actually used across this whole album was a Fender Thinline Telecaster, of which I've got a few. I've got a few different examples, but I've got a 72 original one which I really love. But I've also got this Japanese one from the 90s, which has a certain thing about it that I love as well. So I was introduced to the Fender Thinline Telecaster by my good friend Johnny Castle, who engineered and mixed this record. And it's just an incredible guitar. I was sort of late to the party on that one. I only discovered it relatively later in life, but it's very versatile, but it's sort of got its own thing too. And basically every guitar part on this record is played on that guitar, of which it's that thing over here.
Yeah. You also played the bass too. What bass did you use?
I've got a P bass that's kind of like my studio bass. I use it on everything. I'm not a bass player at all, but I seem to end up playing bass on a lot of records I put out, and my bass style and prowess and technique is very on the minimal level, shall we say. But I really love playing bass. I think I think I kind of should have played bass, but I got into guitar. I mean, I could maybe go and get some lessons off some of my friends, and kind of I basically operate on a need to know basis with the bass, and I'm able to sort of play it enough to get my ideas across. And then sometimes I get my friends who are really great bass players to do it properly.
Yeah. Has Yuri commented on your bass playing on this album?
Well, Yuri is in the live Ferguson Rogers Process band, so unfortunately I've had to put him through the process of learning my bass lines, which is an awful thing to do to someone like Yuri, who's such an incredible musician. But he didn't. Yuri never complains about anything anyway, but he didn't offer too much resistance. So I got through. It's acceptable.
The bass and drums are certainly at the forefront of the mix with this album, which is important for the feel that you were talking about before. Did you do much sort of research into that, or is that just in your blood anyway?
Yeah, I feel like most of the music I make is fairly propulsive in terms of what goes on with the rhythm section. So I remember the first Bamboos record, the very first single we put out. A few friends were like, "Oh, I don't know if I'd mix the drums that loud on a track," but I'd love that sound. I guess I've got a bit of a background in being a hip hop fan, and so I do love the drums to be slamming, and I love bass. I love the sound of a really solid, propulsive, strong and solid rhythm section. So that's always going to be coming through, I think.
The solo on the track Choice really rips. You must have had fun recording that track.
What I've realized as time has gone by is I often go into these projects such as this, and I throw down what in my mind are scratch parts, kind of placeholder parts, and then I end up spending months, the ensuing months, trying to do them properly and replace them, and they never sound as good. So recently I've had the epiphany internally where I go, I'm not making a demo. This is probably going to be the thing. And it's kind of liberating because I think it brings a little more looseness into things, because I think one of my faults is I do have a bit of a perfectionist thing, and I try and get stuff to, it's not like I'm, quantizing stuff to the grid, but I feel like I have to redo something to legitimize it in my own mind, when actually that first initial kind of vibey take, I'll never be able to really do any better than that anyway. So the trick there is to just make sure you're capturing it, with a good signal chain, it's not going in too hot. So it like just you can end up keeping it because a few of the things on here I got a bit excited and they were going into the board a bit hot. And later there's a bit of distortion and stuff, and because I just did it on the fly. But then it's like, well, just leave it in, and you can't really hear it in the mix anyway. So yeah, it's about letting go of that mindset of it has to be perfect, and just going that solo largely sounds good, and we're just going to keep it.
Yeah. The endless cycle of maintenance has some great brass sounds. How did you achieve that?
That was actually a sample I pulled into that, and we were talking about actually the to digress briefly, the live incarnation of the band is essentially 80% Bamboo's members, and the Bamboo's has a horn section. So there was talk early on of actually having a horn section in the group, but we're trying to keep things a little more manageable with this band, because touring with a 9-piece band, as I do with the Bamboos, can be an unwieldy and expensive operation. So we dispensed with the horn section, but there are horns on that track. But when we do it live, we actually put that on the synth, and it actually works really well as a synth as well, the line.
Yeah. There's a bit of vocal harmony embellishment on the album, particularly on Dirty Clean, which gives it that true disco era sound. How did you achieve that?
Yeah, well, Tim really wanted to have a BV section come in on the album, and I was totally fine with that. And we brought in the incredible Rita Satch and Kate Ferguson, who are also the backing vocalists in the Bamboos, and they came in, and that was kind of the last piece of the album, the last piece of the puzzle that went in. And I think it really kind of ended up filling out those sections really well, and was a good choice in the end.
Yeah. At what point of proceedings did you bring in the drummer Graham Pogson?
Well, that was kind of fairly early on when I put all these sketches and groove. I call them sketches. They were sort of like grooves with 2 sections in them. They kind of started out like that, and once I kind of beat them into shape and beat them into a sort of a structure that I think worked, then because I had basically placeholder loops and program drums and things out of Logic in there, and I was always planning Graham to come in and replace percussion and drums. So usually we might actually do that after we had recorded vocals, but this time we really committed to the form of the song, even before Tim recorded his parts and Graham recorded his drum parts at his own studio, where he's got his whole great setup. And that was a nice kind of workflow, because he's set up in his studio, and there's no, with his own drums and his own setup, there's not a huge amount of time restriction, so he could send things back and forth. And it's one of the great I think advantages that everyone clearly takes for granted now, because it's just the standard thing. But someone of my vintage, being able to have that kind of immediate workflow and exchange of literally try the symbol like this, and you're sending it back and forth in real time is really a great way to work.
What is your home recording setup, interface and DAW, etc.?
Well, I've got a fairly minimal setup. I mean, my studio here at home, it is kind of more of a writing room really than a recording studio as such, but there is enough room for me to track vocals, and I've tracked horns, and I can't really set up a full band in here, but I usually always go to an external studio for that anyway. But yeah, I'm running Logic, and I use a metric halo and have a U87 and some keyboards and a bunch of guitars, and I really just use this room to kind of write music for the most part, and I'm locked up in here, doing that.
Yeah. Did you and Tim tweak lyrics together, or do you give Tim free rein with the lyrics?
In this case, as I said, I'd kind of worked these tracks up, even recorded the drum takes and everything, and presented Tim really with it was like a folder of kind of almost finished mixes of these tunes with everything on it, and then I said, "Look, here's what I've come up with." And he really took that away and ran with it. And so the lyrical side of things was all in his court side of the court, and that's the way I think the way it should be, because Tim is such a inventive and uniquely talented lyricist and melodicist, for that matter, that I just wanted him to be himself and do his thing. I'd kind of done my thing, and then the process of coming together in the studio was an exciting time, because I didn't know, and I didn't know what he'd done. I didn't know what he had prepared, and so for me it was a lot to kind of take in as I was hearing it. But that was a really fun day when I kind of finally heard what he'd done.
Yeah. You'll have some live dates for this project next year. What will the band consist of?
Yeah, so as I said, it's kind of 80% the Bamboos. I had the best laid plans of putting a whole new band together for this, but Graham played drums on it, so he was always going to play drums, and him and Yuri are just an incredible musical unit, kind of have that telepathic thing going on as a drummer and bass player. And then Daniel Mugerman, who's also the Bamboos keyboard players in there. And then my good friend Gilly, who is Kurt Rainbow. Sorry, I had to remember his moniker. Kurt Rainbow. Gilly is a great guitarist, and it's really amazing for me to actually play in a band with two guitarists, because it doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen in kind of the genres of music we're working here. It's often just budgetary restrictions mean I'm just the only guitarist around. But because there's so many sort of intertwining guitar parts on this record, we really needed two guitars, and I didn't want to sort of have stuff on track or anything. So two guitars, rhythm section, and then we have Phil Bonotto on percussion as well, who is another Bamboos member, and really, again, the grooves and the songs on this record are percussion heavy, so we really had to have that in the mix. So it's a really fun band. We've done 2 shows so far, and we're looking forward to getting out kind of in the first third of 2025 to play around the country.
Yeah. It'll be impossible not to dance to this music. Do you have to consider the type of venue that you're booking for these gigs, that you can dance?
That is a great question, because with the some of the draconian, shall we say, insurance things that are going on venues, they're saying you can't kind of have a drink and dance at the same time, and there's some things like that going on in Victoria that I've read about. So that is a really good question. I hadn't considered that, but we definitely want people to be dancing. So I mean that's the whole raison d'être, excuse my French, for this project, and we need to have people dancing. So we will take whatever measures we need to remove white plastic chairs and dinner tables from any gig we do.
I think it's the 25th anniversary of the Bamboos next year. Any plans?
Indeed, we I don't know where that 25 years went. I mean, in many ways it feels like a long time, but I also remember packing up our first 7-inch that I had pressed up and mailing it out to people so long ago. So crazy that it's a quarter of a century now, and we're planning a tour of Australia and also Europe and the UK, and we're also planning a release around the 25th anniversary that will kind of coincide with that. So it should be a fun year for the Bamboos as well.
And what about your other projects?
I have a kind of side project thing I do called Rare Groove Spectrum, where I go into the studio and record classic kind of funk, soul, and Latin versions, and do almost kind of like live remixes and reworks and re-edits. So I've got a third volume of that coming out that we've already recorded, and I'm also working on a soundtrack record that is going to be coming out in the first third of next year as well. So there's a few irons in the fire.
Yeah. Well, the album's out now. It's called Style and/or Substance. And Lance, it's been great to chat.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks for your support.